Hello again, my fellow Jeti users, and welcome back to Harry's workshop for another of my little Jeti clinic videos. And this one is about a twin jet engine throttle and trim setup. I'll be using my way of setting up the trims for my jet engines, which is a one-step from the off to the on condition. Some people I know just leave it as the default many steps and spend a long time holding the buttons up or down to get it to the on or off condition. I know some people prefer just a two-step trim for reasons of a little bit of safety of needing to press it twice. I'm a mode 2 flyer, that is throttle and rudder on the left. I don't use cross trims. I've never had a problem using single step throttle trim. So this is how I would go about it. It also helps using a single step because trying to assign the same digital trim on a separate throttle function just doesn't work, and you can use a 2-position switch, which I will do here. And the idea is that we have a 3-position switch where we can select engine 1 to start, and it locks engine 2 in the off or idle position. A next position allows you to start engine number 2, and it will hold engine number 1 at the idle position, and a third position of the switch allows you to run both engines off the throttle. And the fact that I'm using a separate switch and throttle trim for each of the two engines allows me to shut them down individually as well. So let's have a very quick look at what I'm talking about. If we go into the servo output, I'll bring that down. Here's our two throttles for the first engine and the second engine. Minus 100% is the engine off condition for the ECU. I shall use the trim one step to bring engine number 1 up to the running position. Knock the throttle stick there. Meanwhile, I'll move the throttle starting switch to the throttle 1 start. Okay, and now if I press the trim button, so engine number 1 has come up to the engine ready to start condition. And if I operate the throttle, we can start engine number 1, but note that engine number 2 remains locked out. So we do that. Engine number 1 running happily now. Throttle works. Lovely. Let's start engine number 2. So we move the mode switch to engine number 2 and move its trim through this 2-position switch to the run condition. There we are. It's now at the run condition, and I can now operate the throttle to start the engine. Note that engine number 1 remains locked at idle whilst we start engine number 2. There we go. Engine number 2 is now running happily. I can check its throttle response. That's fine. And finally, I'll move my switch to both engines, and now they both work together. But should we need it, because one of them uses the trim button, one of them uses the switch, we can shut them down independently. For example, I will now shut down engine number 2. Engine number 1 still works. Of course, engine number 2's throttle still works, but it shouldn't start up because it comes back at the run condition, the off condition rather than the run condition. But if you wanted, you can move the switch back to T1, locking T2 out, and then shut down T1. Okay, how do you go about it? Well, you'll have noticed I'm using flight modes here. Let's pop into model, basic properties. I'm still using engine count 1, not 2, so that the transmitter creates a throttle function, assigns a trim and a servo for it. Go into functions assignment. I'll create another throttle. I've called it throttle 2. It's operating off P4. Don't assign a trim because it'll work at the top end as well. And of course you let it assign a servo for you. Go into fine tuning. I'm using flight modes. Now, just for the purpose of demonstration, to show it, I've added in a takeoff and landing flap flight modes as well. So default is our normal fly around flight mode unless any other flight mode is switched on. At the moment, T1 starting throttle 1 is switched on, switch there, T2, fine. Switch them off. If I haven't got takeoff or landing flaps selected on this switch, then the next available flight mode that's running is default, so there we go. The reason I've put these in is just to show you the effect. Because T1 and T2, the starting modes, are higher up than the flap modes, then they take priority. So should I switch T1 on, we will actually get T1. If I switch T2 on, we'll get T2. And if you try and operate the flaps, they won't work because you're actually stuck in the engine startup mode. Yeah, which is fine. If you want, we can take these down. Need to go one more down there. There. If you have your flaps on a higher priority than the engine startup mode, that's fine. But you would have to have all your flaps switched off, so your default flying mode, for the engine startup modes to work. So for instance, if I switch on takeoff flap, because it's a higher priority than any of the engine start modes, I won't get the engine starting, even though it's switching on or off. So I've put that in simply to mention, think about which way around you want them. I don't think it matters. It just, if you've given the flaps a higher priority than the startup modes, don't sit there wondering why you can't get your startup mode because you've got flaps engaged. Okay. And digital trim. I've assigned the switch, a 2-position switch, to throttle number 2. And because of the way I like it, to me, the switch forward is the run condition. So I had to reverse it because the default is minus 100% control when the switch is forward. And we need the trim to come forward, so it's plus 100. Your transmitter may differ there. And for both of them, throttle and throttle 2, your throttle should have defaulted to throttle low. So set throttle low on your second trim as well. Because I prefer just a one press of the button to change my trim, the step is 100%, the rate backwards is 0%, and the rate forwards is enough for your ECU to recognize the difference between off and on. Okay, some ECUs you can get away with quite a small step, some ECUs require quite a big step. I've got 60% step here. Remember that trims have half that effect on servo travel, so 60% will actually only move the servo 30%. And therefore, when the throttle's at minus 100%, it'll step up 30%. In other words, it'll go from minus 100 to minus 70%, which is why we saw that a moment ago in the servo monitor when I operated the trim or the switch. Okay, but you'll be used to your ECUs. Now we go down to the function curve, and we go to throttle and throttle 2 and change both of them to separates. Now, throttle will normally have defaulted to this FM delay being off, and you want to make sure that stays that way in all flight modes. So run through all your flight modes, making sure it is still off. Throttle 2, because it doesn't know it's a throttle inside the transmitter, that will have defaulted to a tick, saying on. So make sure you come in here, come across to it, and switch it off by pressing the programming dial, and make sure it's off in all flight modes. So again, run through all your flight modes and check that it's off in every one of them, because it is a per flight mode setting. So it's probably best to switch it off before you change it to separate, and then hopefully it should keep it switched off in all of them. If you change it to separate first and then come back here and switch it off, you probably find you have to do it in every single flight mode separately. What does that mean? In flight modes, we often set a delay for the transition, for instance, on the flaps, so that you get flap slowing, trim slowing goes with it, and so on. And you don't want any movement of the throttle to be slowed by the transition of a flight mode. It would only apply if you're doing something like altering your throttle whilst at the same time you're putting the flaps up or down, and it would slow the throttle response down that little bit. Probably not do you any harm. You may not even notice, but just once in a while, if you slam the throttle open and try raising the flaps, and you've got a delay on it, you're just going to build in more delay, which you don't want. So switch that off. Okay, and this is where we will now do the little bit of magic to get everything working separately. So I will trim down, back there, come into throttle, into the curve, and we're basically, when we have the T2, which is when we're starting the second engine, we want the first engine to be locked at idle, or off if we'd had it off. Pardon the double entendre. So you would come to the mode for starting engine number 2. Notice here we've changed the curve from a standard to a constant. Okay, come down and wind it all the way down. Now, because the Jeti understands the throttle a bit differently to every other function, the value here will actually be 0% rather than minus 100%, but that's fine. Okay, and just check that you've still got the standard curve in every other flight mode. So this is engine number 1 starting mode. So engine number 1 starting mode, we've got a normal throttle. When we're starting engine 2, we want it locked off in a constant. In both engines running, we want standard, and in all the flap modes, any other modes you have, you want it standard. So the only one that you're changing is when you're starting the other engine. Okay? And then we come to throttle 2, and we do the same thing, except for when we're starting engine number 1. When you start engine number 1, you want the second engine to be locked at 0. So you change it to a constant, come down and wiggle it down. And this, I say, is minus 100% because Jeti doesn't understand that this is a throttle. It's just some function with random letters in a name. Okay, so it's minus 100%. It behaves more like a normal function. And once again, check that in every other flight mode, okay, it's just the standard curve. You only want it locked at the 0 position whilst you're starting the other engine. There we go. And that's it. That's it done. And that will give you this behavior. Trim. Okay. So once again, we'll run through it. The throttle stick, if we switch to both, the throttle stick will work both engines together, but it won't start because you've come back to the off rather than the run and start position. And this is absolutely normal for jet engines. It works this way. Okay, let's go to the T1, engine number 1, start mode. I'll press the trim. One step trim comes up. Ooh, I knocked the stick there, sorry. So it's now at the engine on condition, but it hasn't started the engine yet. I'll open the throttle, bring it back. Engine starts up, running quite happily, blah, 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 blah. I will move the starting switch to the second one. So now work that. It's still in the off condition. I'll move the switch. It's now at the engine on condition. And I can operate the throttle. Engine goes through its startup procedure. I can operate that quite happily. Bring it to both engines, and off we go. And I'll just prove that if we go into takeoff flat mode, all works properly. Landing flat mode, all works properly. Okay, after we've landed, if you want, you can switch back to just operating one of the throttles. So that would operate the engine 1, that would operate just engine 2. There we go. But in any flight mode, it doesn't matter. You can independently shut down each engine. So I'll shut down engine number 1 with the trim button. Lovely. And shut down engine number 2 with the switch. And there you are.